Hey, this is Tyler with Survival Dispatch. We are talking about the Barneyed basic level radio functions, how the radios work. In video 1, we talked about the 3 main radio types. We talked a little bit about FRS, GMRS, and ham. And I kind of deep dived into a little bit of stuff I shouldn't have touched. So in this video, I'm just going to talk about antennas, antenna selection, and frequencies so that you understand the crazy question of how far will my radio talk? So stick with me. Okay, so a lot of people think the bigger the antenna, the better. Couldn't be further from the truth if we tried. What really matters is this. All antennas can listen. The size doesn't matter. They can't transmit unless they're the right size. That's the 2 things that matter. RF is just light that you can't see. It has a magnetic component, a heat component, an electrical component. It is a form of radiation, but it's not going to hurt you most of the time. So having said that, if you can imagine a light bulb, you can imagine what the RF radiation is doing from your radio. If I take this antenna, this is vertically propagating. What that means is it needs to be used like this. Not like this, not hidden, not at crazy angles. It needs to be used in the same angle as the receiving antenna, right? They got to match up. There is a level of loss that increases exponentially once I go from in alignment to completely out of alignment. Understanding that will help you. This radio basically makes a bubble, and I'm going to use just the antenna. And the light beam pretty much looks like this. Now, I can't quite see that, right? Looks like a butt or a big fat donut. So what this tells me is if I take my antenna and I point it at someone, I just aimed the hole at them. If they're really close, they're going to hear it. But if they're far away, you just set yourself up for failure. If you want to talk distance, you make it vertically, okay? Make it vertical. So if I want to stretch this out further, which gives me the ability to talk longer distances, because who cares about the sky, right? When an antenna is cut to its exact correct length, it will make a fat donut. When it's cut in half, it'll make a squished long donut. We call that a half wavelength antenna. If I am talking in the 2-meter antenna, correction, if I'm talking in the 2-meter wavelength, I need a 2-meter antenna, okay? That's a big freaking antenna. This thing is talking in the 75 centimeter or 2-meter wavelength, which is either this antenna or this big long antenna. Well, why does it work when it's so short? Without getting too deep, mathematically, as long as it's 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, it will still work. But there's a certain point where your bubble starts getting small and becoming less effective. We call that retarding the lob. Don't freak out, that's what it's really called. So your ability to use a 1/2 wavelength antenna is going to give you the biggest distance for the frequency that you're using. Now, if that's a really tall antenna, then you need to use a 1/4 wavelength because sometimes it's just obnoxious to pack that thing around. There is a mathematical place where a short 2-meter antenna will also work as a long 75 centimeter antenna. What this means is some antennas will work in 1, 2, 3, and 4 different bands. They are multi-band antenna. They're going to work kind of good in all of them, but not really good in one of them. Understanding this lets me know one of the primary things I want to do to make my radio communicate correctly is put the right wavelength antenna on it. So how do we come up with the right wavelength? Well, all of these mathematical equations were based on the speed of light. I know you all are like, oh, he's getting advanced, but it's really simple. If I take 300 and I divide whatever my frequency is, let's say I'm going to divide 150 megahertz into it, that'll tell me what wavelength I need. The 150 megahertz frequency works perfectly by a 2-meter antenna, okay? Because 150 goes into 300 twice. If I do a half wavelength antenna, because I don't want a fat donut, I want a spread donut, well, that lets me know I need a 1-meter antenna for the frequency of 150. Well, what about 145? Still 150. Well, what about 135? Still a 1-meter antenna. So there is a certain point where mathematically I start to fall off the cliff and my antenna doesn't work as well. That's where we bump into another band. So understanding that, that's how we come up with the antenna, with the antenna size. To show this on a graph, if I kind of curl this, it's going to look about like this. And this is a 2-meter with the frequency of 150. Maybe this is 100 and this is 200. What this lets me know is I'm going to talk really good on a 2-meter antenna. And the further away from 150 megahertz that I get, the more crappy that antenna is going to transmit, whether I go down in frequency or up in frequency. Okay, the Barney takeaway from this. All you need to remember is this. It will tell you right on the antenna what the frequencies are and how it works. So I have this dual band antenna that works very well in 2-meter and 75 centimeter. That gives me the 150-ish megahertz and the 450-ish megahertz bands, so that I can talk in 2 bands with 1 radio and 1 antenna without switching it out. They both do kind of good, but they don't singularly do really well, because it's kind of like the Subaru Baja. Does a lot of things, but not anything really, really well. Okay, so if we understand that the RF radiation coming off of this antenna is like light, then we need to understand attenuation, which is the light gets absorbed into the things that it hits. The first rule that we have learned is get the right antenna for your frequency, right? Figure out what frequency you're talking in, get the right antenna. My personal rule is the antenna that came with your radio, it's trash. Put a new one on it. I like diamond antennas. You buy what you want. They all work as long as they're the right size. The next rule in talking long distances is get up above all the trash, okay? If I think of this like a light that's putting out a emission and I'm down inside of the ground, it's going to hit this building and it's going to hit that tree, it's going to hit all these things, and it's not going to work as well. If I just simply bring my antenna up above the house, now I can talk to anything that I can see. In the comment section of some of these other videos, people keep asking me how far will the antenna work? Well, it only works 1 to 2 miles. That's because of attenuation. You are inside of trees or something, and that light is absorbing into those trees. So yeah, it can only work 1 or 2 miles. But if you get the antenna up high enough that it can see, it will literally talk to whatever you can see. If you can see it, you can talk to it, okay? The third rule, and really I'm going to say there's 4, is if you can't talk to it, increase the power. These little handy talkies, they max out at about 5 watts. Some of these mobile radios, you can push them 25, 50 watts. Some of the HF rigs, they'll get up to 1500, but you got to have a license to do that. So if you've got the right antenna and you've got it as high as you can get it and it still doesn't work, then put out as much power as possible. Make your connection, then dial it down until you are using as much power as you need. That way you're not going to create a signal that can be seen in Texas, right? So if your takeaway from this video is this: get the antenna that fits the frequency you're talking in. Get a half or quarter wavelength antenna because it will spread out the bubble that gives you more distance to talk. If that doesn't work, increase the height. If that doesn't work, increase the power. The fourth thing that I talked about earlier is get singular directional antennas, like a Yagi antenna. I will show briefly how a Yagi antenna works. It is basically one of these antennas, which I'm going to call a resonating element, with a larger reflecting element behind it on a pole with little focusing elements. The more focusing elements you have, the tighter the degree of the bubble that it's going to communicate in. Okay? So the power from your antenna goes to this one. It puts out that light, which reflects off of this thing. And the more focusers I have, the closer that beam will be. Okay? The bubble, the communication bubble off of a Yagi antenna looks like this. It's a big lob that's kind of skinny with a little spike here, a little spike here, and a little bubble here. Okay? So if you have a directional antenna, this is it vertical like this, and it's a Yagi antenna, and you have the right wavelength for the antenna, you have the right height for the antenna, and as much power as you can get. The only thing you can do more to push through stuff like the humidity in the air or clouds or trees or whatever is to really focus your beam. This is like taking a flashlight and focusing your beam and then point it right directly at the other antenna that you're trying to talk to. Now with the Yagi, it is sensitive in pushing it and sensitive in receiving it, but it sucks off the sides. So sometimes you can get a signal from the back, but most of the time you got to point it right at, let's say you've got a ham radio at your house, you point that Yagi antenna at the repeater on the mountain, or you point it at your buddy's house or whatever, okay? So hopefully that wasn't too confusing and it gave you simple rules. Get the right antenna, increase the height, increase the power, buy specialized equipment to really focus it. With a Yagi antenna, you can literally push a VHF signal to the moon and reflect it back to the other side of the planet. People have done that, which is really kind of cool. So when you guys talk to me about how far will it talk, if you can see it and your antenna is proper for the radio, you can talk to them. If you can't, there's something in between you that's absorbing the radiation that's stopping the signal. Too easy. Okay, hopefully that was valuable to you. Hit the subscribe button. Maybe I'll make a third video. We'll have to see. Thank you for watching.